but there's no sound. Huh? Okay. So Jin Chuan and Jin Wei are gone, I think. How's that? Yeah, they're not here. Okay, so one of them usually talks at the end, so we'll fill that time in. I am just getting more responses to the poem last week now coming in. This is my karma because I was always late with everything, and everything was last minute. So now, as of a half an hour ago, some of these are coming in. We'll see what we can get to tonight on them. But I was really, I was sort of touched to see people actually responded and sent in either interpretations or even inspired wrote their own, which is a very interesting. And that's legit, because you don't necessarily have to respond to what's there directly, but you can respond with something that has been stimulated in you. And this is really how to work with these texts, is to see them as interactive, reciprocal, that something comes out, you have a response, it goes back, and you begin a kind of conversation or a dialogue. Anyhow, get to some of that tonight. I'm going to go back and lead into something. Basically looking again at the last two verses in your text prior to, so I'm looking at page 7, and I've already read these verses, but I want to spend a little more time on them tonight. Thus, in accord with principle, observe that absolutely everything is without a nature. The Dharma eye is inconceivable. It's seen without distortion. Last verse, whether we name it real or unreal, ro shi, ru bu shi, false or not false, ro wang, rao fei wang, mundane or world transcending, shi jian, chu shi jian. These are merely false words. Danyo, jia yan shuo. So I wanted to go into this a little more tonight. There's two key themes that are coming out of these verses so far, and we'll see there's more going on. But one is in the first passage, in accord with principle, observe. In accord, keeping with principle, that's the li, observe, guan. And the second concept here is everything is without a nature. Now the third one we can touch into spins off of these other two. The idea of name, and whether we name it real or unreal, false or not, mundane or world transcending, these are merely false, or you could say, better equal translation, provisional words. So I think one of the things you see happening here, it's very interesting. The bodhisattvas are asking for clarification, requesting clarification. A question is given, a kind of answer is given, and then more questions emerge. So there's a spiraling thing going on here. So clarification isn't just one answer, but rather it seems to be, as with the poems and things that you were submitting, one thing leads to a response leads to another stimulus leads to a response, and there's a spiraling going on. Which reminds me of a really good line from the Avatamsaka that says, Bodhi accumulates. Bodhi accumulates, it grows, it adds. It's not like that it happened sudden, but rather it's a cumulative process. On one hand, it seems to be that you're accumulating, but actually what you're doing is disentangling or shaving off. So Bodhi is the result of getting rid of that which impedes it, rather than, even though the text that it accumulates, it seems to accumulate, but it's already been whole and complete. So this wording is critical. So I'm going to start with the second one, though. The idea, the line is absolutely everything without a nature. Without a nature is referring to this term we used before, sunyata, or sunnata if you're using Pali. And it's core to the Prajnaparamita teachings. And we already mentioned the Prajnaparamita teachings include the Avatamsaka, sections of the Avatamsaka, the Vajra Sutra, the Platform Sutra, and so forth. It's a huge compendium of teachings. But essentially, two of the major themes are emptiness and non-duality. And so on one hand, Prajnaparamita literally means prajna, wisdom, paramita, perfection of or achievement, realization of wisdom. It's both descriptive and it's describing the nature of reality. So that would be the empty, having no nature of its own. But it's also, like most of these teachings, a practice. So if you remember, any of you, since last time, commit to memory the Heart Sutra? And don't say, if you already did it, don't say anything, but it was a new endeavor. Okay, give it a shot. Next week I'll ask again, anybody commit to memory the Heart Sutra? It's really short. Close. You're close to getting it. Okay. Do you remember the first line? Chinese somebody? Guan Zizai. Husha Xing Shen Boro Bolo Meter Shojen. When the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara was what? Practicing Xing Shen Boro. Practicing. Wasn't studying, wasn't listening. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's both a description, but it's a practice. So then we have to ask, well, what was the Bodhisattva practicing? Practicing the perfection of wisdom. So what I'm saying here, it describes both the nature reality and the lived, engaged practices that lead up to this wisdom. So it's both descriptive and prescriptive. And if you start seeing the text in this way, they really start to come alive. They're not just descriptions of things as they are or might be, but they're actually embedded with engaged practices that you can take up to actually have the direct realization of those things. So they're kind of like a manual, a manual of application. The next part is that the sunyata is often misunderstood because of the translation as emptiness, as meaning nothing there or an absence or a lack. However, if you go back to the sutra, the Heart Sutra, you'll see there's like this incredible burst of joy and happiness and effulgence that the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara experiences, experiences directly, that everything is empty and goes, whoopee! I mean, like, okay, so wow. So obviously the emptiness translation doesn't hit the mark, because we hear that and we hear it as means nothing there or absence or lack. I think a better way to translate it, it doesn't mean nothing there, it means nothing's in the way. Nothing's in the way. It's unimpeded, unattached. The Avatamsaka calls it the unattached, unbound, liberated mind. So this is a very different way of looking at it. To say there's nothing means there's nothing in the way, there's no impediments. Therefore, there's this melting and opening up of the full human potential, and that's prajna paramita, perfection of wisdom. Okay, now these li, these principles, I just wanted to go through some of them. A little technical, but stay with me because when I was studying with my teacher and when he would lecture, he would often tell some really good stories. He would call us up during his lecture and scold or admonish us, sometimes to give us encouragement and or ask us difficult questions personally about what's going on. And then, because he would lecture in Chinese, someone else would translate. While they were translating, he said, oh, come on up, and he'd do a little back and forth. But he did spend time going over the technical terms and the details. And for this, I'm very appreciative because these are really very important. It's like the theory that you need in order to activate this wisdom. So I'm going to go through maybe 4 principles of the prajna paramita. There's more, but these are 4. One is that dharmas are non-existent, phenomena are non-existent. By this it means they aren't permanent, stable, unchanging things unto themselves. That's what emptiness means. They don't really exist because they have no own being. They're conditioned. They depend on other things to come into being, to stay for a while, and when those conditions change, they start to dissipate, and then they're gone. And then the cycle repeats itself. So it's called svabhava, which means no nature of their own, no own becoming. So this means, if you get into this, these dharmas are really never produced as distinct separate entities. They never, quote, come into existence, but they're always coming into, coming out of, conditionally held up, conditionally passing. This, by the way, is very scientific. So if you try to nail down things and say this exists, all you're getting is constant change and transmutation. There's nothing that is in a fixed state, including the whole cosmos. So this is I'm just stating sort of biology, physics stuff here, but the text is saying this. They don't really come to exist. They're never really brought forth. They're called unborn, ajata. So prajna paramita means that all phenomena from form, which is the body, the physical material world, up through the highest levels of understanding, they're devoid of any intrinsic characteristics of a nature of their own. Okay, so this goes to the next line of text. If you look at what you have in front of you, and we're going to shoot down. At that time, Manjushri Bodhisattva asked wealthy leader Bodhisattva, disciples of Buddha, all sentient beings are non-entities. I have trouble with that translation. So, literally, can you see the Chinese? 佛子一切众生非众生 literally all 一切 multitude born many living beings, in other words, not living beings. Well, okay, so why might I have a little trouble with non-entity? Anybody? When you hear that word, do you know it in English, what it means? Mm-hmm. It carries the connotation. I would say it's sort of like, I don't know if my Chinese is good enough, but sometimes I heard it as an insult when somebody says, 你有什么东西? What kind of thing are you? What thing are you? It's almost like an insult. So non-entity in English means insignificant, unimportant. It's actually quite dismissive. It's a kind of looking down. It can, by extension, mean something that exists only in the imagination, and that's closer, but it's still not Buddhist in the sense that you're taking it seriously. And furthermore, it's an uncompassionate way of saying something. You say you're a non-entity, it's like you're nothing, you're insignificant. It's a kind of dismissive wiping away. So I think probably stick with something like the original, living beings are not actually living beings. And putting the actually there conveys a kind of giving you a pause. And that's going back to the first thing, since everything is conditioned and in flux and has no nature of their own, therefore living beings are not fixed entities either. So this immanent insubstantiality that we talked about as this first principle extends to self. All dharmas, all phenomena are without a self, not self. But self itself is a dharma, and that too has no fixed existence of its own. So all phenomena lack this permanent self-existing nature, but non-existent doesn't mean the absence of a self within each dharma phenomena, but more like it's a fleeting, passing presence. So it doesn't mean it's not there, it doesn't exist. That would be, come on, absurd. If I say you're non-existent, all living beings are not living beings, it's saying it's not a fixed and solid entity, but rather it's a fleeting, passing presence. So it's there, but it's also just floating, insubstantial. This is, we can see this in the immediate process. If you look at just something simple, look at your pictures when you were first born, and just look at your photo album and see, where is this persistent, constant, and unchanging self? It's not there. And even now, as we sit here, all of us are changing and getting a wee bit older than we were last week, and moment to moment. So it's not saying you're not there. It's very close to the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who said, you can't put your foot in the same river twice. Because when you put your foot in and take it out, the river moves on, you put it in again, it's changed. So his idea that the essence of the world, in a sense, the elemental essence, was change, flux. Fire was the analogy he used. So characterizing them as sunyata or sunya or empty is a descriptive, but it's not a dismissive or a denial of living beings, but rather just categorizing them as not fixed. The bad part about that, you think I'd like to be fixed, but really you wouldn't. If you were fixed and unchanging, my gosh. Think about, I just read a book by Saramago, who was a Nobel laureate, Jose Saramago. Basically, it's like death takes a holiday. And the novel starts with, in this little town in Spain or someplace, death decides to take a holiday and not come and visit the people anymore. And people wake up and they're immortal. And at first there's this like, wow, celebration. And then after a few days, things start to happen where people realize, yeah, this is not exactly what we were hoping for. The first people to complain about this are the morticians. The next group to complain is the church. And so it's a very interesting read. I can't remember the exact name of the book. It's not Death Takes a Holiday, that's a movie, but it's that theme. Saramago's a brilliant writer, but basically what he gets down to is that then the hospitals are stuck and filled up because nobody dies. And it just go on. Anyhow, you want to have a fun read, take a look at it. But what I'm getting here is that the ability to change is, in a sense, our salvation. And our inability to change is our stagnation. And so impermanence has both a positive and negative. It's a negative in the sense that we think we want to be permanent and unchanging and fixed. We want everybody else to change, especially if they get in our face. But, if everybody's the same, think of the family dynamics, think of marriages, think of jobs, everything. It's like there's a stagnation. So the way to look at this when it's talking, and that's why it says in the next passage of text, going down, I'm jumping around a little bit, observe the body in detail throughout. What if it is actually me? You see this line, this first line? We jumped ahead a little bit. One who understands in this way comprehends there's no self to be found. Self meaning permanent, unchanging, immutable, fixed self. There's nothing you can't find it. And again, I come back to this and say this is extremely scientific. There's no body of science I know that actually postulates and says there's an unfixed changing self at the core, from the micro to the macro and so forth. So, give you another line. This is from to support this. I think Heng Sure is lecturing on the 10 transferences now, isn't he? Saturday night from Australia. Huh? Sunday night. Okay. What do we have Saturday night?
Chapter 39.
Okay, so Sunday night is the 10 transferences. Boy, are we out of order. He's 9, he's doing 39, and then 10 transferences. We're jumping all over the place. Wuyo Dingfa. So this is from the 10 transferences to support this. It says, the Bodhisattva clearly understands that no living beings are born, nor are there any living beings who turn and flow in birth and death. Although there are no living beings which can be spoken of at all, we merely follow worldly custom in falsely referring to them. So this is a second principle of Prajnaparamita, and it's very, very difficult to get at. It's not saying that living beings don't exist. It's not saying there's nothing at all. There's not saying there's no point to cultivation, and none of that is being said. All it's been said is deal with things as they really are, constantly changing in flux with no permanent nature of their own. This is not the end of your cultivation, it's actually the beginning of your cultivation, to wrap your mind around that reality. And our minds wrap around unreality. We pretend that everything's permanent, unchanging, and fixed. And reality keeps hitting us with that. As you mentioned, the passing of a mother. Okay, it's like passing death, sickness, your portfolio collapses, the interest rates you should, all of this is constantly hitting us. And suffering arises not because of these things, but because we refuse to accept reality, and in our minds we consciously resist taking it as it is. And we constantly either are fantasizing or fearing what it is not. So the next principle would be dharmas have a purely nominal existence, name-only existence. This is the second Prajnaparamita thing I wanted to do. They are mere words, a matter of conventional expression. I know this is hard to get at, but again, you go back now to the second verse above, it says, whether we name it real or unreal, false or not false, mundane or world transcending, these are merely false words or provisional words. So this is the second core principle. If things are in flux and there's no permanent nature to them, you call them this, but they're not really that. They're already changing as you call them this. You know what I'm getting at? It's like everything, because it's changing and in not a fixed permanent position, it's always in fluctuation. So birth, dwelling, going bad, dying, sickness, death, these are along a continuum with no fixed borders or boundaries here, but a flux or a flow. So the text will say these are merely supposed words, suppose, other, provisional terms. Why are they called false here? Maybe because they give the impression of a substantial, real entity. But they're merely symbols, or the text will say fingers pointing at something. They conceal the insubstantiality of all things. Now, this comes up, the word that they sometimes use is to reify. They make real what is not real. I know this seems like it's very abstract and hard to get at, but when you start to realize that our construction of what we call reality is actually in opposition to how things really are, it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. We think of me and mine as permanent and solid and substantial, and our world, and I mean, people in Florida just woke up to an incredible reality of the insubstantiality of things. And you see the cars floating around and the TVs floating around and everything else. All this world that people constructed, they do day to day and every day, all of a sudden, just like that, a storm comes through and just reasserts the unreality, the insubstantiality, and the utter impermanence of everything. And yet, people will be shocked, crying, they have the rug pulled, I myself, and within a few days, maybe a few hours, we're back to reconstructing, fabricating that reality. This is what a very important Yogacara text is about. It's called the Samdhi Nirmochana text. It's probably the earliest and most important, I think, of the Yogacara text. And basically what it's saying is that it goes in and says the ultimate meaning cannot be grasped or seen through concepts and language. Since all things are empty of an inherent essence, svabhava, and words, ideas are only provisional. Thus, why ultimate reality is beyond language, and they say apart from names and words. Awakened beings provisionally invent linguistic conventions as expedients to lead beings to awakening. So they use encouraging, expedient words and whatnot to lead beings past the point where they're attaching and grasping at these as real. However, these words, this language, have no absolute existence, and the text says they're like the works of a magician. Everybody knows what a magician is, right? I'm just wondering, because I know there's two magicians that come on television every once in a while, the Penn and Teller, right? But apparently, as Sherpa was mentioning, he says, in ancient China there were real magicians, not these sleight of hand guys. They could really conjure up things. They weren't just, pulling a rabbit out of their... So, but either way, if they're real magicians or they're sleight of hand magicians, what they present to us seems real, but in fact, it's an illusion, right? So this is what it's hinting at. And the third point, the dharmas, phenomena, are without marks. Okay, so the Heart Sutra, do you remember that line? Form is emptiness, emptiness, so too are feeling, cognition, formation, and consciousness. All these dharmas are without marks, or marked by emptiness. Now what does that mean? It means they have no distinguishing characteristic that you can point to and say this is a distinctive property that separates them from all other dharmas. Things shift and change and transform. Everything is, Huineng says it's of a piece. There's nothing special or distinctive about these when viewed in that way. So what this does, it sort of desensitizes you to the emotions attached to these things as being real. And you start to see them as along a spectrum of earth, air, fire, water, matter, and energy. They're not necessarily fixed in certain things that you can grab and get a hold of. This is actually called a samadhi. It's very interesting. The first time I heard this, somehow it resonated, even though I'm not sure I understood it, but it was called, the Bodhisattva enters the samadhi of the level equality of all dharmas, the evenness of all phenomena. And that's called the single mark samadhi. In the Platform Sutra, it's called Yixing Sanmei, the single mark samadhi. And if this is in this, if it's a single mark, it means it's not distinctive and separate. Okay, it's nothing special about it. And so you don't attach to it and grab at it, and you don't push it away. Things are just, they use the word thus. I know this is a little hard to grasp, but if you can get a feeling for this, it gives you a space between things and you're grabbing onto them. You start to see them as not necessarily as special or distinctive. This isn't the flux of passing phenomena. This is important because we had this difficult passage of text this week in our Platform Sutra. And that's not true. That's not true. It can't be. That's not my experience. And what was the line? To the awakened person, all places are the same. No. When I leave the city, it's very different than being at the city. When I'm at the monastery, it's very different than being at home. No, so, but it says to the awakened person, all places are the same. To the unawakened, I didn't say this, but to the unawakened, everything seems different. Well, how could everything be the same? It's not saying that all places are exactly the same. Come on, guys. It's saying something closer to the awakened person is the same in all places. Okay, so they have the single mark samadhi is everything is just of a piece. Everything is just not special. It's just us. And so because they're in that state and they don't give rise to fear and jealousy and grabbing and grasping, they're the same wherever they go. And because they're the same wherever they go, the experience of the place is pretty much the same. Somebody just said to me, yeah, I've been traveling a lot. It's getting more to the point, like every place I go, it's the same. And I was, what do you mean? Like Florida and France and, Copacabana? Yeah, it's not that they're not the same, but I'm taking something with me that makes them the same. That's a kind of awakened prajnaparamita insight. So that's why you can say to the awakened person, all places are the same, because they have a steadiness, the level equality of all dharmas. They can't be thrown off. It doesn't mean they repress. It means they see things wherever they are as a passing, impermanent phenomena with no substantial nature of their own. They still are engaged. That's why the platform sister says they're everywhere engaged, but they're nowhere attached. And that's that no impediments. That's the prajnaparamita, where it's not empty of anything, but it means there's, how did I put it before? There's nothing in the way. And that leads to this wonderful liberated state that the bodhisattvas are described as having here. It's a very last point. This non-production, non-destroyed, okay? It doesn't mean there isn't a presence, there isn't a fading, there's a cyclical thing going on. But not produced and not destroyed is not talking about a fixed entity. That now you look at birth and death, it's a different thing. Because really, again, scientifically, between birth and death and birth and death, there's a continuation. I will go into this next week with some detail, but from our point of view, someone dies and that's the end. But from a nature point of view, there's just a continuation. Microbes, bioorganisms, and so on and so forth. And in spring, new things come forth from this dead morass, okay? As we mulch, or what do we do that? Mulching and what's the other thing you do with your vegetables? Compost, okay? Birth and death, what are we doing here? Just throwing this out as a thought. So, because this is that state, then this is illustrated by the famous passage of number similes. All conditioned things are like dreams, illusions, magical illusions, echoes, reflected images, mirages, bubbles, flashes of lightning. Flux, flux, flux. They're there and yet they're not there. Just think of lightning. It's there, but it's not there. We're here, but from another point of view, in terms of time, we're gone in a flash. Okay. Now, let me move on from those four. What's interesting, I think, about the observe, what was the line again he had? Observe with principle, accord with principle, and accord with principle observe. It's almost as if, instead of giving an answer, Manjushri giving an answer, or the other bodhisattva giving an answer and saying, here's what you should know, or here's what you should believe, he's actually saying, here's how you should think. That answer, thus in accord with principle observe. So instead of saying, I'm going to give you the answer, he's saying, here's how you could find that answer with principle observe. Well, what does that mean? This is really rich. At least it's rich to me. It might be rather bland for all of you. But when I first came to Gold Mountain Monastery, this was 1975, two teachings really jolted me right off. First one, I came in and I asked an elder monk, what does this master teach? And I was like, what does this master teach? What's going on here? And he said, he teaches all beings have the Buddha nature, all can become Buddhas. It's only because of confusion and attachment that we don't realize that. And I was like, whoa. I mean, for me it was whoa. Now maybe you hear this and it's not whoa to you, but like, given what I'd been doing with my life before that, that was really like a hammer on steel. And the next jolting teaching I got was this line: subdue yourself, return to principle. I don't know the Chinese, this is a translation. Subdue yourself, return to principle, Li. So those two really stuck. Now, part of it was an inspiration for me to say, here's how you can go. Subdue yourself, return to principle. But it was also a bit of a, scolding. Well, we were a little loose cannons in the 60s and 70s. I know some of you weren't around then. If it was a law, we broke it. It was an authority, we challenged it. If we were told not to do it, we did it. This is a few of us. So those early disciples that came in were not Li. We were naughty. So I had no idea what Li meant, but I got a feeling. When the master mentioned it, I felt, okay, it's referring not wild, not narcissistic, not mindless, abandoned to whims and passions. That's what I felt it to be. Not selfish, but towards nurturing maybe something spiritual, a reverence for life, for the common good. These are the kind of impressions I had, but I had no idea. But last week I was talking, Li describes these deep abiding patterns of coherence that exist. They're valuable, intelligible ways that fit together. And these patterns tune and align the cosmos, the workings of the natural world and our social relationships and our inner psychology. And they give meaning and order to all things if we can align with them and we can discover them. So Li describes these patterns that can be harmonized and made to kind of hum, so to speak, to foster the human good, to make it valuable and intelligible. The way I think of it now is, I mentioned this before, some of you ever backpack? I remember well, it's not usual for people to backpack these days, and especially if you're not in the Western culture. I was backpacking in the wilderness for 2 weeks. I was coming out of the wilderness, beard and scruffy and dirty, and somebody announced, "Watch out, backpackers coming." I thought, okay. And all of a sudden, over this rise, came all these people in little white shorts and white socks and white tennies and little hats the same. It was a whole Japanese delegation. And their buses there were backpackers. And they got 20 feet off the road, took some pictures, turned around and went back. That to them was backpacking. Then back to the lodge for a nice meal and whatnot. So going into the wilderness and going into nature is different to different people. But anyways, if you're really into the wilderness, they have things called cairns, C-A-I-R-N-S. I've talked to this before. And so where there's no trails, you find a way, you make the map, you know it's a trail, you leave a pile of rocks as a marker. And then you go certain ways and you leave another one. And so you're marking a trail out for those to follow. So sometimes this is also called navigation points or waypoints. Waypoints, and not Tao, but it could be Tao, which I like, but waypoints is a reference that can be used for location or navigation. They traditionally associated with features of the real world, such as rock formations, springs, oases, mountains, buildings, roadways, waterways, railways, and so on. But basically, it has the same idea that Li are these cairns, or these waypoints, that you steer by, that you reorient. Now we have GPS. Okay, so Li is kind of the inner GPS. It's your inner compass that you activate. My teacher's expression for this was, when I started to get an idea of this, he said, therefore, if it's the way, advance, if not the way, retreat. So you're constantly checking the points. You're constantly taking reference. Now, how do you know it's the way and not the way? It's said to be innate. And I'd say, well, sure, how do I know it's the way, it's not the way? How could you not know? How did you forget? But it wasn't just a kind of clever koan. What he was saying was, pay attention to how you lose your way. That's more important than to try to think about there's someone that'll give you the way to get back. Because if you don't understand how you lost your way, you'll continue to do it. So, Now, I quote you from a text. This is from a Chinese philosophy text. When it's functioning, it says, when something is right, you will immediately know it is right. And something is wrong, you will immediately know it's wrong. Nothing will be able to deceive you. This Li, this inner compass, once activated, functions like a compass and T-square in events and changing situations. Isn't that wonderful? It's sort of like, and it's not ideology, and it's not religious belief. There's something very organic built in that all beings have this inner compass. It's not particular ethnicity or religious persuasion or ideological belief system, but rather it's said to be almost organically innate. This is Xing, the nature. So then it's also said, the mind is Li. The mind is the true pattern. They use true pattern here as a translation. Mind without coverings of selfish desires, that's Li. Not having a mind entangled in craving and resentment, that's Li. So again, Li is the function of this emptiness. There's nothing in the way. So this then becomes how it interpenetrates back and forth with specifics and principles, constructs, abstract, but how you live and how things are start to connect. So now I'm going to ask, anybody have an obvious question to this? Because it was a question, again, I asked my teacher because I thought I was really smart back then. That's very funny. I mean, when you read a great teacher who's got great wisdom, and because you have a master's degree, you think pretty smart. Okay, here was my question. If it's inherent, innate, and complete, then how come I don't have it? Where did it go? Or maybe, how did I lose it? And again, his answer would be, that's a really good question. Why are you asking me? Oh. So here's a quote from a Chinese philosopher circa 1500, and I really like this passage. Mencius gives this wonderful passage. He describes a similar phenomenon. He says, we have it, it's whole and complete and innate. And if we don't nurture it and we don't tend to it, and we hang out with the wrong people, and don't examine our feelings and impulses as they come up and just let them run wild like the 60s, you will lose that. You'll lose this mind, this Li. And he said the strange thing is when a farmer loses his cows and his chickens, he goes out with a lantern all night looking to get them, even if it's only one. He says, but when we lose our mind, we don't know to look for it. So, and then he said, learning, education consists of nothing more than the recovery of the lost mind. So here's the passage I wanted to share with you. This is from Lu Nan, a Chinese philosopher at the time. People differ in where they lose their minds. Some lose their minds to wealth and profit. Some lose their minds to food and drink. Some lose their minds to fine clothing. Some lose their minds to luxurious houses. Some lose their minds to power and position. Now, this is 1500, have fun. Okay, so wealth and profit, let's extrapolate a little bit. What would that be? Some lose their minds to the stock market. Some lose it to one-armed bandits. What are those? Slot machines, okay. To IPOs and profit, okay. They lose their minds to food and drink. Wow, we can elaborate on that, right? Because as we advance and grow in our sophistication, we have more foods and more drink. Berkeley is a gourmet capital of the world, really. I mean, within a couple blocks of here, you can just lose your mind to food and drink. You can lose your mind to food and drink when you don't even leave the monastery. You can just be sitting here thinking, what was on that menu? You go, oh, cool, wow. after the class, I'm going to, and all of a sudden your mind's gone. Fine clothing, whoa. Anyhow, you can, in luxurious houses, all the various ways that you can, and that includes some very special tents. No, I'm serious. Up in Maine, my niece decided she was going to rough it. And yeah, it's called glamping? Glamping. So she said, I'm getting a tent. I said, wow, you are? Because you've always been a little bit of a wuss. Oh, I know, I'm going to rough it. Well, pretty soon the tent comes. It takes 6 people to lift it. It takes a special platform we had to build to put it up. And you put the tent up, and it looks like, Lawrence of Arabia's gilded dome. It's got LED lights in it, all this mosquito netting. It's got a sound box with an LED. And then spending the night there, it was nicer than my cabin, but it was roughing it. So, luxurious houses. Since where each person loses their mind differs, must go back to where he or she lost it to gather it back in. Since it differs to where you lose it, and that's the thing about Wei Guang Fan Jiao, which is what my teacher said. So do yourself, return to principle, and then he said, return the light and illumine within. Don't go around fault finding and figuring what everybody else is on. Try to figure out where you're losing it. And of course I couldn't. And so he had to help me. Because where we're really losing it could be our blind spot. Where we lose it is where we think we're really investing in making our life something. And whatever we can't see through and put down becomes the impediment. But we don't see through and put down the things that we think are absolutely us. And so this is why it takes a really good advisor sometimes to say, don't you see what you're doing? Don't you see you kind of lost your mind here? What in the world's come over you? What in heaven's name have you done? This kind of, yeah. So where we lose it differs, we must go back to where he or she lost it to gather it back in. And then the last line, this is being truly human. He didn't say this is spiritual. He didn't say this is being bodhisattva or sage. To be truly human is just to mend and mind, the heart. Okay. I'll say a few more things. Maybe you guys didn't think of this, but when I was growing up, my grandmother, who was my, what am I going to say about my grandmother? She was my teacher, my punisher, my third eye that watched over me all the time, even when I was trying to sneak around. But she was very proper. She was late Victorian. And so everything had to be done properly. I would come in and she'd say, how are you today, Martin? Good. What? Stand up. I'm good, Grandma, and how are you? So this is how I began, Everything was like this. In any event, her idea, unfortunately, was that Li, these deep coherent patterns, basically was to do what was expected of you, to fit the mold. In a word now that we use, then it was positive, to conform. But now it's taken on a different connotation. But the thing I wanted to point out here is that Li is not about the superficial conformity. This we have to be careful of. Let's just look at Martin Luther King as an example of this. He said, when the laws are immoral and unjust, the only place a moral and just person can be is in jail. So what he's saying is you don't conform to moral and unjust laws and think that's Li. Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, this line, some of you will know this. If a person does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it's because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. Then how deep the ruts of tradition conformity are. So Thoreau, again, at his time was saying what everybody is going for and thinks I should be doing, especially since he was a Harvard graduate, he resisted. And this had to do also with he refused to pay his taxes for a war that he thought was unjust and ended up in jail. And so his teacher, Emerson, I told you the story, Emerson came to visit him and says, look, I can get you out, we can postpone, blah, blah, blah. And he says, have you lost it? What are you doing in there? And Thoreau's answer to him is, what are you doing out there? Again, the Martin Luther King kind of approach. So this happens again. So I got Martin Luther King, I got Thoreau. How about we try the Buddha? Okay. The Buddha, for Lee, was not in conformity to what was expected of him from his parents and counselors in his society. And I'll give you this quote. This is coming from the Buddhacharita, the life of the Buddha. When he stepped out of the palace and saw aging, sickness, and death, the fire, the impermanence of everything, he kind of asked the question, what's the point? What's the point? And his father said, you're going to be a prince, you're going to take over. All his counselors said the same. And he says, I'm quoting, how strong and powerful your mind must be, father, counselors, that in the fleeting pleasures of the senses you find substance. You cling to sense objects among the most frightful of dangers, even while you cannot help seeing all creation on its way to decline and demise. By contrast, I become alarmed and greatly frightened when I reflect on the dangers of aging, sickness, and disease and death, and I can't find peace nor contentment and enjoyment. It's quite out of the question, for the world looks to me as if it's ablaze with an all-consuming fire. Obviously, he found some principle deep, but it did not match with the expectations of his time and what was coming from it. So all I'm trying to point out, and I used to do this when I was teaching in the elementary and secondary schools, and parents would come in and say, oh, we're really happy, we want our child to be a good, virtuous Buddhist, and da, 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 da. And I said, you really? Yeah, we want him to go to Harvard, Yale, and wait a minute. What if they decided to be a good and virtuous person did not mean going there? They couldn't answer. They thought that a good and wise and virtuous Buddhist would obviously be on the success path. And the quote I read you earlier is this is often where people lose their minds rather than complete their minds. Anyhow, wow. Okay, my last quote. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to save everything people sent in because I'm running out of time. Sorry. I lost my time, not my mind. I'm going to do it next week because some came in late. So I'm going to read everybody's who submitted. But those of you who didn't submit, now some of you didn't submit because you were wanting to see what others submitted. But I don't think it's an open site, is it? No. No. So you can't see what others submitted. Do you remember the great passage in the Platform Sutra when Master, the fifth patriarch says, I'm going to have a contest of verses, and whoever writes the really penetrating verse will get the robe and the bowl and be the next patriarch. And so Shen Shou sweated all night, was worried about if I write. He said, boy, if I write it and it doesn't make it, it'll show that I've wasted my time cultivating. On the other hand, if I write it and do, then I have to put my name down. And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? So anyhow, he sweated and sweated over this and didn't get the verse right. So in case you're doing that, don't do that. It's not a contest like that. Just have fun and enjoy it. And some of the ones I did quickly look at are really quite interesting. So I'm going to share them with you next week, what people wrote. But I'm saying anything you heard tonight is game for next week. So the Thoreau quote is game. The philosopher I quote, how people lose their mind. And this one I'll give you here. And the Buddhacharya verse of the Buddha to his father. These are all posted, right?
This last week, not this week.
Could we post this week's too so everybody could have a shot at it?
Sure.
Yeah. Some people, nobody responded to the longer one. Everybody responded to, well, and somebody said, it's not like I'm responding to because it's shorter. Methinks she doth protest too much. But in it, the long one was on there, wasn't it?
No, because you told everyone to respond to the short one.
Oh, my bad. Okay, So tonight you have a choice. Some are long, some are short. The one I was going to give tonight, I was going to give another long one, and then on the way over I said, oh no, they like a short one. So I had a short one, so I'll give the short one next week. This is a short one from Tao Yan Ming, really wonderful one. But the one I'm going to close with tonight is the one I really like, and this is also from the Tao Te Ching, and it matches with my experience with my teacher. Here's the quote. The saying, quote, what others avoid, I too must avoid. How false and superficial this is. Now you could do the reverse. What others are drawn to, I too should be drawn to. How false and superficial this is. All people indeed are wreathed in smiles. I was watching the politicians. I mean, they turn that on and off like, wow, like a light switch. They're wreathed in smiles as though feasting after the great sacrifice, as though going up to the great spring carnival. Then the person here, the sage, says, I alone am inert. Do you know what inert means? Like, not really active, not a cheerleader. I alone am inert, like a child that has not yet given sign. Do you know what that means? A child that has not yet given sign. This is, you can interpret it, but what it means is there's a stage in child development where you take the baby and you go, the baby's like, hasn't given sign. Once it gives signs, it does goo goo gaga back or cries or whatnot, but it responds to you, but it hasn't gone out of itself. So that's what I'm alone, I'm inert, like a child that has not given sign, like an infant that has not yet smiled. I droop and drift as though I belonged nowhere. All people have enough to spare. I alone seem to have lost everything. Mine indeed is the mind of a very idiot. So dull am I. The world is full of people that shine. I alone am dark. They look lively and self-assured. I alone seem depressed. I seem as unsettled as the ocean, blown adrift, never brought to a stop. All people can be put to some use. I alone am intractable and boorish. But wherein I differ most from other people is that I prize no sustenance that comes not from the mother's breast. So I'll throw this out. I won't do an interpretation tonight, but suggest those last lines as I'm boorish, I'm intractable, I'm adrift, I don't seem like anybody, same as Thoreau's. But the difference is I prize no sustenance, no vital thing that doesn't come, and mother is capital, mother's breast. So in interpreting this, you'd have to say, what is mother's breast here? It's not literal, obviously, but it's referring to something else. Anyhow, I will stop there for tonight. Encourage you to come back with I really enjoy reading them. I actually do. And it's amazing. Nobody did the same thing. Even though you responded to the same verse, everybody's response was quite different, quite interesting. And none of them were, quote, wrong. But you could see the kaleidoscopic variety of people's minds as they come to a verse like that. So don't add. Don't go back and do last week's. It's done. It's over with. Can't get it back. But these, if any of these cut your interest, and they'll be on the website? Yes. Okay. Give a shot. Now again, please, 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 don't use ChatGPT or AI. Please. I know this seems like, prize no line or writing of yours that doesn't come from the mother's breast, which is not AI. That's your own intrinsic. This technique I'm sharing with you is not mine. This was the technique my teacher used called developing inherent wisdom. So he would do this with us and get us to think about these and respond in our own unique way and not compare and contrast with anybody else and just see if we could start to have a kind of access to these ancient lines of wisdom and see what catalyzed them within us. And yeah, so don't necessarily do any research on it at all. Just take it at face. Now, I will say something else. Those of you who know the Chinese are welcome as your response to give another translation of this. Okay, I'm giving translations from different sources. But the poem I'm going to give you next week, I'm going to give you two translations of English of the original Chinese. So if you want to do that, that's very interesting. For example, last week, the birds have vanished in the sky. The clouds of birds have vanished in the sky. Now the last cloud drowns away. We sit together, the mountain and me, until only the mountain remains. That third line is literally, we sit together and not bored. We sit together and we're not bored. So the literal Chinese is also very interesting. It's sort of, what's that about? It means I'm out in, this is not Maine. When I'm up in Maine, people sit there and they're bored. They sit on the dock looking at the mountain, they get bored. So when this says we sit together, the mountain, Maine, we're not bored. What's that about? What's boredom about? Interesting. Anyhow, any questions, anything on tonight or this, the verses? Going once, going twice. Sorry, I ran out of time again. Yes?
Maybe 2 classes back, you were kind of sharing some of your insights about being out in nature and spending time there.
Being what?
Being out in nature and spending time there. Do you have any advice what to take from that? Because, I mean, I just hike through, look at some green stuff, it's nice, but do you have any more advice or suggestions about kind of how to be in nature?
It's a beautiful question, and at the same time, it's such a troubling question. You know, in the sense that nobody asked me, you have any advice on how to be at the mall? You know, how to be at the football game? You know, how to be at the party? No, but how to be in nature. And it's almost like, be like a child who haven't yet given sign. In other words, and I'm going to go into this again, the poem I want to use, the description of this is you have to, what's the word? You have to strip down. You have to get rid of all the fancy accoutrements and sophisticated ideas and even desires and expectations. I got half an hour in nature. Okay, come on, nature. I got 20 minutes ago and nothing's happening. You know, that is nature giving you your mind. And so what nature does when you get there, it actually reveals your mind to you, which could be boredom, it could be da-da-da-da-da, and that's the gift of nature. So don't have any expectations. Go, like, I don't know, when I was growing up in Wisconsin, 6 or 7 years old, I would just take a peanut butter and sandwich and just go out into the woods and the creeks and streams for hours. And I never was bored. And as we grow up, we lose that. Or we gain sophistication and maturity. I'm not sure where the trade-off is. But these texts all talk about returning, going back, reverting. And the poems I want to give you from Tao Ming and explain his life was he became alive when he left his profession and the capital and went back to be a simple farmer and a reclusive writing his poetry. And it wasn't a romantic kind of sentimental thing. There was something in nature that connected and made him to rediscover himself again. And so you got to kind of not be afraid of dropping and letting go of things, and just immersing and see what happens. And maybe nothing happening is an immense reward. But I'll go into this again more, because I want to share this stuff with you. These poets and things from this thing is very rich, and it's so, Tao Ming himself was Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist. He didn't see a difference at all between the three. He just naturally combined them all. So you don't even have to be Buddhist to get into this stuff. And in fact, he said, this is to be truly human. He didn't say to be religious or spiritual. So this to me are the teachings of the human, of humanity. These are the deep, almost like the most important things to conserve and pass forward of how to be a real human being in a very deep and original way, and not necessarily convert to anything. So anyway, good question. But next week, there'll be more on that, because it is a good question. He struggled to do that. He struggled to do that. He thought he'd lose out if he went. But the world got where he was in his profession as a government official got so, it sucked so much that he just felt I have to go someplace else. And then only then, when he went, did he realize what a great place it was he went to and what a horrible place he had left. But he had become habituated to fame and to a good income and so on and so forth. And his poem that I'm going to read next week, he says, I'm going back. Why has it taken so long? Why has it taken so long? Okay. Anyhow, we'll do the transference in English. I went way over tonight, but I forgot the line. So the person in class says, by the way, although the sixth patriarch says to the awakened person all places are the same, it's not in any other text that I've ever encountered. So it must be just him. I said, well, you ought to try reading the Avatamsaka. But the Avatamsaka says, to the awakened one, all places are the same, and then adds, and all times are one time. So all places are one place, and all time is one time. So this is my way of rationalizing going overtime tonight. It's all one time. Okay, let's do the transference in English. And do you know how to send the poems or your responses in? Because I was getting them through email, right? Is that how?
Yeah, I will send them all to you.
So send them to him, right?
Yeah, on the website. They just follow the instruction on the website.
Okay. May every living being our minds as one and radiant with light share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the triple jewel.